And we're live. Good afternoon, everyone. Joining us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. We're really delighted to be having this conversation on this afternoon. My name is Letlokhonolo Mokgogwane. My pronouns are he and they. I'm one of the co-founders of a literary podcast called The Cheeky Natives. I will be in conversation with these wonderful guests today. But before I begin to speak about why we're here today, I'll give my co-host, Dr. Alma, an opportunity.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Letlokhonolo, for the opportunity. My name is Alma Nelisha. I am co-founder of The Cheeky Natives. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation. And I think that it's going to be one that's really insightful and one that's very fruitful as well. And so I look forward to the engagement.
So we've been given an absolutely important task to launch today's report. And the name of the report is called Invisible, Isolated, and Ignored: Human Rights Abuses on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Expression in Colombia, South Africa, and Malaysia. And it's absolutely a really wonderful report that has been written by the International Commission of Jurists. And we are today in conversation launching the report, and the report will be shared after this conversation. But we thought it was so important to bring together these activists to speak about the importance of the report, but more specifically to speak about what's happening on the ground, particularly in this area. So before we begin, we'll go around the room and just for people to introduce themselves and to give us their preferred pronouns, and then we'll begin the conversation. So we can ask Anil to begin, and then we'll go forward.
So hi everyone, my name is Anil Padavatan. I am the programs manager at Gender Dynamics, which is a human rights organization based in Cape Town, South Africa. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a transgender man, and I'd like to wish everyone a happy International Day of Trans Visibility.
We seem to have lost Letlokhonolo. So while we wait for Letlokhonolo, I'll just ask that we continue. Is Letlokhonolo back? Okay, you are back. All right. Can I ask Akani to please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Akani Shimange. I am the executive director of Matimba, an organization that works with trans youth in South Africa, and my pronouns are they and them. It's good to be here.
And then we can move now to Santiago.
Okay, hello, my name is Santiago Carvajal. My pronouns is he and him. I'm a lawyer and a gay activist and co-founder of an NGO that supports parents with sexual diverse children. I have been a research and consultant in sexual education, sexual diversity, and gender identity. And nowadays, I work at NGO called De Justicia as a research assistant at the Department of Gender, and I live in Colombia.
Thank you so much for that. And then we'll also have our last speaker introduce themselves from Malaysia.
Hi, everybody. Hello. I guess my name is Tilaga. My pronouns are she, her, they, them today. And very excited to be here with everybody to celebrate this launch and also on Trans Visibility Day. So happy to be here. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I think, it's absolutely important that ICJ chose this particular day in order to launch the report. One of the major reasons is that, particularly the report in relation to Colombia and South Africa deals specifically with human rights abuses against transgender persons. And so it was really important to have this conversation on this day. So what we're going to do is we're going to just go right into the meat. We don't have much time, and we want to try and get as far as possible out of this. So we'll start with you, Santiago. When it comes to the respect and protection of human rights for LGBTI persons, the ICJ report shows that Colombia has a strong legal framework. We often call it very progressive because it guarantees both civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. However, in practice, LGBTI persons still face significant discrimination and violence on a daily basis. And we wanted to find out from you if you can tell us more about the situation of LGBTI persons in Colombia, particularly during this time.
Well, thanks again. Even when Colombia has a progressive legal framework, LGBT persons have no witnesses much improvement in their living standards or a significant reduction in the discrimination and the violence they face on the daily basis. The possibility of enforcing rights is significantly reduced as you move away from the major cities. In addition, living in the capital city does not ensure the full guarantee of the rights. Violence is a specific rule against trans and non-binary people. Violence also exacerbates in other spaces such as schools, public spaces, the family, and the rural areas where the presence of the illegal armed groups is there. Some elements that help to understand the phenomenon are the country's religious past and the macho culture that continue mandate strict gender norms. So, in addition, there is a national public policy for LGBT people. That sounds good, right? But the current government has refused to implement it. This no implementation response to the agenda of the reconciliation of the political parties in the right wing of the political spectrum. So, in conclusion, in Colombia is the case of a strong legal framework that doesn't guarantee a high human rights protection. That's more or less quickly background of that things happen in Colombia in between this is particular and dystopic situation as very strong, but in the present don't the legal strong legal frame don't guarantee the rights of the LGBT persons.
Thank you for that. I think that it ties in really nicely with my next question, which is for Akani and Anil. We've seen with the ICJ reports that, as with Colombia, South Africa has this very strong legal framework which protects the rights of LGBT people, especially with the Constitution prescribing against unfair discrimination based on sexual orientation. But similar to Colombia, as we're seeing in practice, just having a legal protection doesn't translate into real everyday protection of the human rights of LGBT people. So I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit more about the general situation of LGBT people in South Africa, but also particularly to speak to transgender persons.
Akane, do you want to go first?
Okay, thanks for the question. I think similar to what Santiago was saying, right? As a country, we have possibly one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. It explicitly names sexual orientation. We recognize civil unions. We have a legal gender recognition law. On paper, we're beautiful. In practice, I think we have continuously failed to actualize these rights. Access to education, access to healthcare, access to anything that is a general need for every other human being has not been the same for LGBTI people. And as marginalized as LGBTI people are in this country, trans people sit on the margins of that marginalization. So we, as trans people, access to education has been, I think, one of the most important and most difficult situations, because it has a ripple effect that leads to socioeconomic problems. That means you don't access healthcare. And the government has this thing of, they kind of tokenize the whole LGBTI conversation when it suits them, when it's pretty, when it's Pride Month. But there hasn't even been, and this was an interesting conversation I had yesterday, there hasn't, when a country that has founded a lot of trying to rectify the past with things like BEE and women empowerment, has failed to have that conversation around queerness. And these tools have not worked for queer people. They've actually continuously worked for Black cishet men. And so there's a particular thing around how we are erased, but we are spoken about in the Constitution.
So, as Akani has said, in South Africa, we're kind of known for having this gap between our excellent legal and policy framework, which guarantees human rights, and then the implementation and people's lived realities. And I agree with everything that Akani has just outlined. The major issue that I think particularly the trans and gender diverse community is facing is issues around the kind of intersectionality of oppression within our society, because we've come from a colonial history and apartheid history, and then also a history that's strongly marked by patriarchy. And we therefore have this divide, and where you fall under a divide is largely based on the historical context of the country. So you have people of color are significantly disadvantaged. There's issues around gender equality. And if you are a trans woman of color, you're going to bear a disproportionate burden. And then on top of this, we have the kind of power structures around gender binaries. And if you are trans, but you're falling into a binary, you're marginalized, but you still have a space in society. But if you're not non-binary, we actually don't have the mechanisms, even within our progressive framework, for recognizing and providing services to people who are not falling in the gender binary. We have an identity system, and we're going to be talking a bit more about this later, which classifies everyone not only with something on your identity document saying whether you are male or female, and the little F and M that sits there, but it's actually coded into the identity number. And I was recently putting together a training manual on health issues, and so I was interviewing community members on their barriers to access to healthcare services. And a gender fluid person said to me, as a gender fluid person who's non-binary, I don't only feel marginalized, I feel that there's no space in the society for me at all. And this is the kind of level of marginalization that people are at, especially if you are a person of color in South African society, especially if you are in a rural area, especially if you're from a disadvantaged background.
Thank you so much to both speakers from South Africa. I think you bring up such important issues that often when we think about South Africa, we think of it as a queer utopia, but there is no utopia for certain bodies in South Africa. And even though we are coded into the Constitution, we're sort of erased by a number of respects, which we will deal with a little bit later. But I think this is really important to bring a really stark contrast between, the very progressive legal frameworks that exist in South Africa and Colombia and contrasted with those that exist in Malaysia, right? The ICJ report shows that unlike South Africa and Colombia, the legal framework in Malaysia is not progressive at all. Moreover, that there are still several laws that criminalize sexual orientation and gender identity. And then besides these like public discussion about sexual orientation, gender identity, and expressions, these topics are often seen as taboo in a place like Malaysia. In practice, it also means that LGBTI persons face discrimination and human rights violation. And also it's state-sanctioned sort of discrimination because the state criminalizes these people. So can you talk to us a little bit more about the situation of LGBTI persons in Malaysia?
For sure. Thanks so much for the question. I guess you've wrapped it up quite well. Like, it's bad on paper and it's bad in practice, right? As what the previous speakers have said. And I also see commonality between as what the previous speakers have said, the intersection of religion and patriarchy is also something that is, these are also critical components and intersections in Malaysia as well. So I'm just going to maybe spend a bit of time in just talking about the situation in Malaysia, maybe a bit repetitive. So as you mentioned, LGBTQ persons in Malaysia are criminalized under various laws. So this includes Section 377, which is a British colonial law. Section 377 in Malaysia is gender neutral. And it is under the federal law in Malaysia, which can be used against anybody regardless of their religious background. But, as we know, although these laws are gender neutral, they disproportionately affect LGBT people and in systemic ways as well, right? The other thing in Malaysia is that other than the Section 377, LGBT people are also criminalized under state Sharia laws on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and for having consensual sex with adults, right? So on top of that, as mentioned by the previous speakers, trans people do not have access to legal gender recognition in Malaysia. This has been a process that's been regressing over the years. So legally, we are dealing with over 30 federal and state laws, right, that criminalize LGBT people. So it's a lot. So if we are tired, folks should understand that, I know, I'm terrible. So the environment of criminalization in Malaysia is also aggravated by other harmful policies and activities that promote rehabilitation. The idea that LGBT people can return to the right path, or, as we know it as conversion practices, right? So in the past, we have seen state-led activities from, introducing an app for people who are seeking rehabilitation, retreats and camps, seminars, and more. So there's a whole infrastructure and ecosystem built around rehabilitation and conversion practices, right? Malaysia is also a Muslim majority country, and the conservatives are influential. Religion and freedom of religion is highly regulated by the state. So in the past few years, we've also seen a rise in anti-LGBT groups and ex-LGBT groups aided by the state. So this then often creates a lot of tension in us trying to seek rights, right? Because for the state and the conservatives, rehabilitation or returning to the right path is part of a LGBT person's religious rights. So I know I see you folks nodding because this is the same thing from the same playbook, right? So the criminalization and rehabilitation efforts work hand in hand in creating greater sense of chilling effect on the rights of LGBTQ persons, and this environment also makes it very risky for human rights defenders, especially queer human rights defenders, to organize, criticize, impart information, build networks, etc. Right? Case in point, a few human rights defenders in the past have questioned state policies in relation to rehabilitation of LGBT people, have faced severe backlash, have had police reports against them, and been harassed online for days. So similar to folks in other contexts, we too deal with scapegoating, harmful LGBT narratives and social attitudes. This includes how we are sinners, HIV spreaders, gender identity is invented by LGBT people, and all those things that we're familiar with, right? And similarly, we've also seen an increase of discrimination and violence against LGBT people, and these are quite worrying trends. I also want to say that, the reality is, in this these things are happening against the backdrop of, a significant number of LGBT people having low level of self-acceptance and connection with other LGBTQ persons or groups. And a lot of times their connections are limited to their friends, right? Not necessarily LGBT folks who can help you make a report to the police and things like that. At the same time, they also have high levels of fear of being outed and being discriminated, being disowned by family members and such. So I also want to end this by, not on a non-depressing note, I guess. And I would just like to say that although there are so many challenges in Malaysia, but I'm really excited to see that LGBT people organizing, and in the past few years we have seen more and more LGBT groups coming up, like mushrooms after the rain. And we are also seeing a lot of different tactics and ideas that are being employed by LGBT groups. Like, for example, we've mounted several legal challenges, expanding services, and we are creating our own pathway to change, right? So lastly, I think we are also really excited to see how LGBT groups getting involved in broader human rights advocacy and democracy-related advocacy, right? So that's really exciting because it also breaks that idea that, LGBT people only care about our sexual orientation and gender identity. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think that it was wonderful that we ended on a more hopeful note. My question is for Santiago. In reading this report, it was quite stark to see how many instances of violence have been perpetrated by the state and also by non-state actors in Colombia. We're seeing that for decades, LGBT persons in Colombia have been subjected to violence that's motivated by prejudice, discrimination, and stigma. It was actually so stark for me to realize that after Brazil, Colombia is considered the most dangerous country in the Americas for LGBT people. And so I wanted to know if you could just tell us more about this situation and how this violence has affected transgender people, particularly in Colombia.
Okay, thanks. Well, like the report mentions, violence, and not only violence, murders too, are frequent and are perpetrated by state and non-state actors in Colombia. This is a huge problem because no effective investigations have been conducted into the vast majority of the cases in those which an investigation is carried out. Under a rule, it does not advance to there is the impunity in the process. In part, this is explained by the existence of some sectors of the society that have been promoting a political agenda against the rights of the LGBT persons in Colombia. They have, for example, arguments like the report mentions that LGBT persons are using the gender ideology, and with they aim to destroying the traditional family and changing the sexual orientation of the children, like it's possible. They have also taken the view that it's not appropriate to let same-sex couples or LGBT persons raising childs. And unfortunately, national and local authorities have not taken decision actions to stop the dissemination of misinformation about LGBT persons. Recent, a case of a couple of lesbians have not the chance to get married for a judge, and they involved in a legal fight to try to resolve that incident. And imagine, this is a recognized right, and happen that kind of things. For finish my answer, This is especially problematic with trans people who engage in the sex work and gain visibility in their communities. Some illegal armed groups have used violence, includes sexual violence, to punish or attempt to correct LGBT people and send a persuasive message to the community. This practice has been called social cleanliness, whose purpose is to erase the sexual diverse in the territories that are under control of the armed actors. Remember, even when the 2016 Colombia signed a peace agreement, still today we continue in a process in the violence is the rule, the normal rule in some areas of the country.
And I think it's also important because you also have a different context, right? Because the report also indicates that a large part of the violence also happens in like armed conflict. So it isn't only violence that like it's broader because of the territory, but these people who find themselves already in a vulnerable position are further marginalized and violated based on their gender identity and their sexual orientation. This brings me to a question for our former South African activist. The ICJ report highlights that transgender persons face several obstacles to demand the protection of their rights. And I think about something that a friend of mine wrote where we theorized about the second closet, this idea that like you belong in a closet that society is already placing you in, but in order to sort of demand your rights, people, state-sanctioned, constitutionally mandated people who are supposed to protect you do not do that, pushing you into another closet of not reporting violence, not doing particular things. But I wanted to speak specifically about like the really problematic Alteration of Sex Description Act, right? And thinking about the process of gender markers. To speak a little bit about like, people think it's so progressive, in South Africa, you can just walk up one day and go change your gender marker, but they don't actually understand what the process is. So can you talk to us a little more about the nightmare of the Alteration of Sex Description Act?
Wow, interesting analogy around the two closets. I think so this progressive law, beautiful, written, just like our constitution, is so flawed, right? So it was passed in 2003. It was supposed to be a stock law. It was supposed to be changed. It wasn't supposed to exist for this long. First, it medicalizes trans bodies. There is a very invasive, not only does a doctor need to vet you, but a second doctor needs to vet you again to say the other doctor was telling the truth. You are actually the person that you are. There's no guidelines at Home Affairs. So you walk in and you're like, hi, I've come to change my gender marker. And they all go, what's that? And depending on who you find at that table, you get very invasive questions. Have you done the surgery? I think all trans activists have been trying to figure out what the surgery is. We've all been throwing this around like, what do you think they mean? Because I don't even think they know what they mean. But I think what South Africa continues to fail to understand is that not giving people access to legal gender recognition is also like taking away their ability to participate in society, to basically transact in society, right? It highlights a lack of respect for people. It highlights a lack of human dignity. It highlights how we are not seen because legal gender recognition or an ID or a birth certificate is elementary to who you are in the world. And this is the most basic of basic things. And when we look at this law that we're trying to get amended, it's flawed on so many levels. It doesn't speak of youth at all. It doesn't speak of migrants in a country that has so many migrants. It is so binary. So you can only be male or female in this world. And now that you have ticked this box, we can change your entire ID number, but no other system works with it. So you do it at Home Affairs, but education doesn't know that. So you have to now go to the Department of Education and go, hi, Home Affairs says. And then they go, prove it to us. Then you go to the Department of Transport and you're like, hi, like the amount of labor behind a failed system and the ways in which a country shows once again that they actually don't care. So they wrote a piece of paper, but did not put in the systems, right? I'll let Anil add to that. It's a very frustrating.
So Akani, I definitely share your frustration with this, because this morning on the International Day of Transgender Visibility, I was busy fielding questions from a community member who was standing in a Department of Home Affairs office and had all the necessary documentation, which is the onerous documentation that is required by this act, and ready to apply for their gender marker change, and once again got the question from the officials, but have you had surgery? And if you haven't had surgery, then we're not going to assist you. So this is an ongoing problem, and it is happening today, despite high-level interventions from the minister. And I think it speaks to the really deeply ingrained prejudices within our society. And there's all these levels of violence. So yes, queer communities in South Africa are subject to very much the similar types of violence that the other speakers have been talking about. And then there's this kind of institutionalized discrimination and violations of human rights and human dignity. And it's these invasive questions about surgery. It's the fact that there's no regulations or guidelines, so officials can do their own kind of creative gatekeeping and bring their own prejudices into play. And I once tried to intervene in a case where there was the same official had turned away 3 different community members on one day, giving them all different excuses for why their applications could not be accepted in that particular Home Affairs office. And the way this to start with the way that this was implemented, it started off with you could apply for a gender marker change, but if you were married in terms of existing South African law, you were then subjected to this kind of administrative divorce where they either said, either we can't process your application or we're forcibly divorcing you from your spouse. And which is a massive violation of people's human rights and human dignity. And that had to go to court in order to be resolved. And that same mindset is still at play today in Home Affairs offices around the country. And I think what we're seeing now is we're into another law reform process. There's high-level buy-in from the Department of Home Affairs, from the Department of Justice, but no buy-in at the moment from the Department of Health, and we're waiting for them to come to the table, because one of the kind of problems that we have with this medicalized model that they have at the moment is you're required to have undergone some form of medical transition, and gender-affirming healthcare services are only available in a handful, literally a handful, because it's about 5 big urban centers around the country, and in the rest of the country it is not available. So you're creating a requirement which is then most of the population is not able to meet. So it's the ways that we need to have of addressing the gaps between what is on paper and then the practice, and then the kind of feedback loop of, even when you have this high level buy-in, how are we then holding the state accountable for what officials are doing on the ground, whether it's Home Affairs officials refusing to accept your application, whether it's the police not investigating the cases of violence, rape, murder, whether it's the teachers that are telling students that they've got to wear a school uniform that does not coincide with their own gender identity, and forcing them to wear clothing that has a massive psychological impact on them. All of this we need to be addressing.
Thank you so much to our speakers. My next question is for our speaker from Malaysia. And I think that we've seen in the reports that when it comes to the rights of LGBT people, the criminalization of consensual same-sex sexual relationships, transgender, and gender non-conforming identities really is a massive hurdle. Additionally, it also contributes to the further marginalization of these persons. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact of having this dual legal system that we've read about, and the ways in which having these often conflicting but very similar laws affects LGBT people, but also these constantly shifting goalposts and the ways in which we're finding that even the law contributes to societal factors that represent massive obstacles for the rights of LGBT persons.
Yeah, totally. Thanks so much for the question. So I just want to firstly say that, I think that's a really great question, because when we look at the dual legal system, and as we know, the state Sharia laws only apply to Muslim persons in Malaysia, but that doesn't mean the laws don't have an overarching impact on all persons in Malaysia, right, regardless of their religious background. I would just like to point to one example. Like, for example, other than the laws that I talked about earlier, there are also fatwas, which are religious edict that are generally given out by muftis and state religious authorities. And there are a number of LGBT-specific fatwas that are discriminatory. And one specific fatwa that I would like to point out is the one on that declares trans people as haram or illegal in 1982 and also in 1983. So the impact of this fatwa was that, as a result of this fatwa in 1982, the trans-specific healthcare that was provided in a semi-government hospital prior to that was immediately stopped, and there was a shutdown of trans-specific healthcare for all persons regardless of their religious background, right? And this fatwa as well has a cascading impact on legal gender recognition. So in the past, we have seen a lot of trans people, not a lot, I'm probably exaggerating, but a number of transgender people who've gone to courts to seek legal gender recognition. So the other process, other than being medicalized, which is which is a really problematic approach, I think a judicialized approach is also equally problematic, right? When these are just administrative processes that, you should just be able to go to a counter and tell them, hey, this is my gender identity, and get something corrected. So I think the fact that it is judicialized and medicalized in Malaysia, and that is extremely problematic because it incurs a lot of cost when trans people have to go to court and get all these declarations and things like that. And in many of the cases that we have observed and documented, a lot of trans people's, a lot of the applications to seek the declaration for legal gender recognition is rejected because, how it will affect the moral fabric of society. And, one of the things that folks go back to is this fatwa that declares trans people as illegal, right, or haram. In 1982. So here we see that the overarching impact of even though there's a dual legal system, what we see is that these laws and policies affect everybody, and it also disproportionately affects Muslim persons, right? Because Muslim persons are then subjected to not only arbitrary arrest and detention, but also extortion with impunity, right? And then the added layer of self-guilt and self-esteem issues that you have to deal with, because now we are also dealing with the internal self-conflict of being a sinner and being a deviant under the law and being criminalized under the laws. So I think it has, the fact that, the criminalization in and of itself creates adds a different dimension and layer of issues, psychological, mental health issues for like LGBT people, right? So the environment of criminalization has many layers of impact, from the personal to the collective, to the society, at large, and also to the state and globally as well. Because, in many contexts, even in the context of Malaysia, one of the macro larger impact that we are seeing is in terms of migration. A lot of people, not maybe again I'm exaggerating with this a lot, right? So a significant number of people have sought asylum, especially trans people have sought asylum in many countries because of the discriminatory legal environment, and how that then leads to lack of opportunities and access to services. And a lot of trans people have been, granted asylum. Because they say valid discrimination, right? And I just want to point this, give some statistics, I guess. To support my point on this migration issue, so between 2007 and 2018, over 50% of asylum applications received by the Australian Administrative Appeals Tribunal were reportedly by Malaysians. And one of the four main reasons cited by the applicants was sexual orientation and gender identity. So we see that actually, the legal environment, the discriminatory environment, has a huge issue in terms of forced migration or voluntary quote unquote migration, right? I just, one last point, I guess, in terms of the macro impacts that we're seeing, public health is a big issue in terms of mental health and HIV as well. In some government reports, we also see that the government actually projects that MSM or queer men to be the main key population that will be affected by HIV by 2030. So we are looking at big, broad impact that will have a significant impact on the healthcare system, on productivity, brain drain, and all of those things, right? I guess I just want to end with one last point. The criminalization of LGBT people, although some of these laws are gender neutral, gendered, and all of that, they also reinforce a gender binary. Right? In the past, we have seen trans people who are arrested and charged for liwat. Liwat means sexual relations between men. And so trans women, are charged under these laws, and it reinforces again this idea of the binary. So I guess in the broader scale, I guess it continues, it sort of reinforces this perception that the binary and how LGBT people are deviant and should be criminalized and punished and all of those things. Yeah, that's all for now.
I mean, I think that's really powerful, because you've really spoken a lot about what an over-judicial system looks like, an over-medicalized system looks like, which I think is really important, because I've been thinking a lot about the contrasts between Malaysia and South Africa, and what works in South Africa or doesn't work in South Africa necessarily works in Malaysia. So you think about the Alteration of Sex Description Act, right, where a lot of us as activists in South Africa are moving away from the idea of this pathologizing and medicalizing of gender. And in a number of cases in Malaysia, because it's been so religious and there's a lot of religiosity, you find that we use the medicine in order to make the case for trans people to be able to change their gender marker in a judicial system. So it also makes us realize that we need to be very context specific about sort of the underlying tensions that we deal with when we deal with LGBTI issues. So something that works in South Africa may not necessarily work in Malaysia, and something that's work in Malaysia may not necessarily work in South Africa. And often I feel when we think about LGBT issues, people just want to have a one size fits all. But this report particularly gives us a really great resource to think. We need to be very careful about when we talk about self-determination, what does that look like in every context, right? I want to go to Santiago now and speak specifically because this report also focuses a lot on like the pandemic that we're currently in. And, you know, the ICJ report talks about the different legal challenges presented by the COVID pandemic in the protection of human rights of LGBTI persons in Colombia, for instance, right, where it's been identified that there is like this upward trend in the number of killings of transgender persons during 2020. So we want to talk specifically about how do you think the pandemic has impacted LGBTI persons, particularly trans people, and loss of life as well as lack of protection and discrimination?
Well, I refers to the violence and the murders previously, but however, exist other impacts that I classify in five. The first is the response to attain any kind of violence, physical, symbolic, or psychological. And this is very important in specific two groups. The first is LGBT children and adolescents, because have the risk to expulsion from the parental house to reveal their real gender identity or even the sexual orientation. That happened because parents have high supervision over their adolescents, specific in this period of the isolations in the houses. Other groups of persons in the related with the isolations periods are suffer episodes of domestic violence, and they don't have safe places to run away to escape from their attackers, like shelters or something similar. The second group is the transgender woman sex workers, because the police are chasing them, yelling and shooting with rubber bullets. This is terrible. When the sexual works occupies the public space to try to gain money to survive. And that is double discrimination, because if that sexual workers don't work, they don't have enough money to pay the rent or have food. Well, the second group is the LGBT people need to be included in the policies created by the state. That mention that the sexual orientation and the gender identity can be considered for designing or implementation of a specific aid for the vulnerable groups. Well, the government tried to do something similar in the beginning at the beginning of the pandemic, but that is not enough. Well, the aid need to be provided should be to able to transform these dangerous factors into the deeper and complex scenario against this group of persons in this pandemic. So some examples of pay the rent for the transgender woman sex worker, that is a very vulnerable group, or give an income so that they able to buy essential items. And in the other is pay the utility service like electricity or water. But some people from the LGBT community didn't receive stimulation checks because the line to provide that aids is very low. So that means many persons don't have the opportunity to access to them. And in these cases is a very important thing about the LGBT elders, because the elders don't have the support network to help them to, for example, buy medicines or provide food, or even have a support network to try to prevent damage to the mental health. The third group of the of that factors is the health issues. Um, Many studies and survey applied to the LGBT persons to ask about their mental health almost always conclude that they have greater risk to suffer anxiety, depression, and suicide. Sorry, this word all the time. It's hard to me. Suicidally thoughts. And yeah, this is very complicated because this is generalized in the pandemic and the isolation period, but it's very problematic when you don't have a network, a social network to support the risk and the things happen in this period of the isolation. Uh, well, on the other hand, as usual, the Colombian health system is not a safe place to LGBT people, particularly with the transgender persons who suffer discrimination due to prejudice. And that happen all the time, and it's not a safe space to the transgender persons to try to obtain their treatments or the theory or whatever that the asking to the or the needs of the transgender persons. Therefore, it's the political and lawmakers as using the pandemic like a smoke screen to generate or create a backlash against the LGBT rights. Here, specific in Colombia, present projects to try to transform in the only one way the concept of the family. Very traditional family is the only concept that they are to implementate in Colombia. And they, of course, it's very risky to the LGBT persons don't fix in that model of family. And of course, that is possible because the public eyes is focused on the news about the COVID-19 problems. And the last and the five problems created by the pandemic is the migration by Venezuelan persons. LGBT migrants are more risky to suffer violence and a double discrimination. That vulnerable situation is problematic, very, very problematic for the transgender persons because they have a lot of problems to access to the health system and obtain the treatments, or in the other cases, obtain protection against the violence for the policy and other national authorities. So that is the five scenarios to I classify the situations exist, of course, previous to the pandemic occurs or happen, but now is more deeply with the pandemic because is the risk is the risk situation I increase.
Thank you so much for that answer. I think that it really leads nicely to my question to Akani and Anil, right? When you think about the South African context, we're realizing that COVID-19 has in many ways created more problems and more difficulties for transgender persons' rights, right? So when you think about barriers to access of medical services, etc., have been limited because of COVID-19 related measures such as lockdowns and restrictions. And I wanted to get a sense of whether you could give us more information about this situation. And also, I think that something important was touched on by Santiago, and that is the idea of people who may be refugees and what seeking treatment now looks like for them in the time of COVID-19. And I guess the final layer, which I'm always interested in, is the ways in which having a dual healthcare system continues to further entrench inequalities, particularly during times of restrictions like the COVID-19 related measures.
Thank you. I think what sits with me is there was a thing that went around beginning of COVID that said COVID is a great equalizer, right? It doesn't choose race, it doesn't choose age, it doesn't. Anyone can get it and anyone can get sick. But I think for all of us, what we realized is it wasn't the great equalizer. It was a thing that actually highlighted how much we were going through and how oppressed we were. And all of a sudden, people felt like we are equal. And what they think is bad is the everyday life of a queer person, of a trans person, right? And so, and I think as Santiago was talking, I was thinking around how South Africa can't even talk about how COVID has affected trans migrants, because we have never, like, we don't see them, we don't speak about them. They're not in the programming, they're not in healthcare, they're not in access to anything. So we can't even, it goes back to legally recognizing people as human beings, right? So let's say we rolled out a vaccine in South Africa today. You know who doesn't get it? The trans people without IDs, right? So immediately we already know that these are not people that are being thought of. And I think COVID, I think there were two aspects. There's the organizing aspect, where as activists, we thought we had figured it out. Before COVID, we're like, we actually get how this works. We're talking to governments, we're doing this, and all of a sudden we can't meet. We can't talk to each other. We need to go back to the drawing board and figure out what organizing looks like online for people who don't have the funds to organize online, right? Like, the fact that we're having this conversation online is a luxury in itself, right? And the person who needs the conversation is usually doesn't have access to the conversation, right? And so I think that threw a curveball at all of us. We're all just like, what does this look like? But it also already isolated people. It took trans kids and put them in homes where they are not safe, where they are not seen, where they are violated, right? I don't think we can even imagine the stats of how many children have been violated in the last 2 years, right? Like, we have no idea. And I think that is scary. We're queer, we have mental health problems. The world continuously comes at us. And then you basically said, let me go sit with my mental health problems, right? I can't access healthcare. Hospitals are basically shut down in this country. Accessing a hospital in this country is like the hardest thing at this moment. And like, no one's talking about the fact that we basically don't have hospitals for anything else but COVID, right? Trans people who were supposed to have surgeries, their surgeries were stopped. They were told it's not an emergency. It's almost 2 years now. We're going into the second year. You have said to someone who has fought for this their entire life that actually, you're not an emergency. So we will rethink this when the time comes. Department of Home Affairs stopped issuing gender marker changes because it's not an emergency. But to access the COVID fund that was being given to people, I need an ID. So I can't have an ID, and I'm the most marginalized. But so I can't even get the fund. So who is the fund for, right? So I think for interestingly enough, for the activists, it highlighted how much this government continues to fail us, which we've known, but we're just like, wait, is it this extreme, right? And I wish and I hope it is documented enough for the government and the general public to actually know that this is what the average day of every queer person is, right? Of trans people is. And I'll end this by saying, and I've quoted this so many times because I love it. Someone said, COVID did to people, allowed people to live how trans people have lived, right? So trans people wear masks to disguise to walk through this world, right? We continuously sanitize our personalities and ourselves to be accepted by the world, right? We isolate because we're actually not allowed to participate in this world. So COVID is nothing new to us. We have done this. We've been doing this our entire lives.
So I think Akani has really encapsulated it there. All of these pandemics, whether you're talking about HIV or whether you're talking about COVID-19, they impact disproportionately on the most marginalized sectors of society. And as has come out very strongly in this conversation now, that's people of color, it's sex workers, it's street-based people, it's migrants, it's refugees and asylum seekers. And all of these people have been the most impacted by COVID-19. And then if you're transgender, you are even more impacted. So with my organization, Gender Dynamics, we work very closely with a collective of street-based sex workers in Cape Town, transgender women who call themselves the Sistershood. And they've been mobilizing and trying to fight for their rights for several years now. And during last year, we lost 4 members of the Sistershood, either to COVID or to health problems caused by disruptions to access to healthcare, because people were not able to access their healthcare services. In Cape Town, street-based people were coerced or lied to and moved into what was called shelters, but were actually detention camps in horrendous conditions, subjected to violence, and not able to access their healthcare services. And if you're on chronic medication, that then has an impact. So we have lost people. We are the people are kind of, we're in lockdown, lower lockdown level now, and the vaccine is being rolled out, and people are kind of have this mindset of COVID is over. It is not over. The virus is still out there, and we're being impacted by it. And the economic impact of it is being felt and will still be felt for years to come, especially by people who are living on the margins or who are working in the informal sector. And as Akani said earlier, if you're trans, one of the first things that happens to you is barriers to education and barriers to economic opportunities and barriers to state social security services. So all of these barriers push people to the margins. These are people who are living on the edges and making their livelihoods in the informal sector. And the informal sector has been the most heavily impacted by the COVID lockdowns. People have lost their livelihoods. We continue on a daily basis to get calls from people to say, I'm hungry and I have got no food, I have got no water, and I've seen these posters everywhere to wash hands and I can't wash my hands, I've got no soap, water or sanitizer. So there's been big mobilization around this. And also to kind of come back to some of the positives is that a lot of us who are working in human rights at a kind of advocacy level had to rethink ourselves and start offering what is basically humanitarian assistance. And we're offering food parcels, we're offering food vouchers, emergency shelter, organizing emergency counseling for people who are undergoing this kind of immense mental strain and stress that Akani and the other speakers have been referring to. And I think that one of the things that we've done really strongly is people got creative, and we started looking at how do we get services to people? If we can't reach people with food parcels, how do we get online vouchers where we can send a supermarket voucher to someone in a different province where there's no services available? How can we get food parcels to migrants? Which organizations are working with them? And there's an organization called the Fruit Basket who's been literally saving people's lives by getting food parcels and food vouchers to migrants who are left with no livelihood, no income, no means of supporting themselves during the lockdowns. And we had activist doctors who were saying the state services, people are cut off from state services, and activist doctors were jumping into the gap and providing reduced rate online consultations. We had psychologists who were sometimes providing free counseling services to assist people in these contexts. So I think that it's been a hard lesson, and it's a massive impact, and it will continue to be felt. But I think we need to kind of pick up on these lessons on how do we, first of all, get the services to the people we need them, and then more importantly, how do we continue the advocacy in this to continue to hold the state accountable, because it shouldn't be human rights NGOs that are providing humanitarian relief to people on the street.
Thank you so much for that. I think both you and Akane make such really important points about like COVID has really allowed us to look a little bit closely at our living situations, right? And know that like for some people, this may seem like it's something new, but for us, it's been something that has been continuing, right? We either fighting for our rights in the street, our rights in the workplace, our rights at home, our rights in the church, wherever we may find ourselves, we're constantly fighting. And sort of people seeing COVID as like a, you know, what people want to say an equalizer, but it's not an equalizer. It's actually showing more the disparities that exist and how certain people will constantly live and be pushed to the margins because they can't have access to full humanity because of your bureaucracy, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, queerphobia. But Akane mentioned something really interesting, and you know, Akane does work with Matimba, which focuses on trans and gender diverse children, and you know, trying to get support in that regard. But it made me think about the report in this way, right? In Malaysia, COVID has had a very put some LGBTI persons in hostile situations, right? For instance, the report sort of speaks about the restrictions that have forced LGBTI persons, specifically young LGBTI persons, to live with family members, right, who are unsupportive of them. And this has exposed them, as Akane has mentioned, obviously to possible violence, but it has also exposed them to anxiety and depression. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? About the idea of like how this pandemic, although people are saying we're going to be social distancing, for some people, social distancing in a particular household is not the best reality that exists.
No, thanks so much for the question. No, absolutely. I think for a lot of people, being placed at home in quarantine with their family members, especially those who are non-affirming and accepting family members, was complete torture, right? Like, because they had far less space to express themselves. If they are gender diverse, then they have to hide their gender expression and also their mannerism, because our queerness manifests in so many different little ways that we don't. It's not something that you turn on consciously. Sometimes you do, but like, sometimes it just flows out of you, your queerness, right? So it's just oozing out of you. So I guess like sometimes it's challenging for a lot of people, and especially when we spoke to students and young people, they were they were really upset and saddened by the lockdown and not being able to be in the universities and and the hostel, and having to be at home with their parents because now they have to like conform to their rules and regulations and things like that. So definitely we saw a lot of cases of isolation. In fact, a lot of two LGBT groups, one trans-led group, saw an increase of trans people and LGBT people in general seeking shelter over the period of the lockdown specifically, and pandemic in general. We also received a lot of cases of for mental health support, and this ranges from anxiety, depression to suicidal attempts, and some of these cases have increased in terms of their severity, right? So I think that's also important to note in terms of the severity of the cases. And I think other than that, like, we've also seen like some LGBT groups having to carry out rescues because, LGBT people were in high risk and hostile situations at home. I think one other interesting thing is that the connection between employment discrimination, your HIV status, and also being disowned or discrimination within the family or domestic violence, right? Where I think, like, some of the things that we saw through our documentation was that because of the pandemic and folks being laid off their jobs, and that resulted in, the LGBT folks being outed at home, within the family, and that resulted in them, being disowned and things like that. So the termination of jobs had such a huge domino effect on the livelihood and the stability for a lot of people. So that was something interesting that we saw for people of all ages. And I guess and also we know that sometimes some acceptance is also linked to financial independence, right? So I think that is also something that we need to probably look at. We also documented cases of forced marriages in the time of the pandemic, which we thought was serious for especially queer women and also trans men. Because a lot of trans men who are presenting their gender expression in non-masculine ways, I guess, are more vulnerable to having their movement restricted and being subjected to forced marriages and things like that. So we saw some of those things around domestic violence and mental health burden. But what was interesting is that although, generally there were statistics showing that there's an increase of domestic violence over the period of the lockdown, but but there was no statistics collected for LGBT persons, right? So as a result, none of this was documented by other groups except for LGBT groups or by the state. I also agree with, in the time of the pandemic and lockdown, I guess we also saw increased vulnerability of LGBTIQ persons to profiling based on their gender expression and having their privacy violated. So we documented a number of cases where the police would look for LGBT apps like Grindr or whatever on their phone. So I think that really intimidated a lot of people. The other thing that I would like to point out is the separation from partners and loved ones, because in this pandemic, I think one of the things that came out strongly, as Santiago mentioned, was traveling between borders, right? And in a situation where, in a context where LGBT people are criminalized, and the same-sex marriage panic is so high, it's really difficult to talk about queer relationships, right? So, oh my God, what's happening? So I guess in this non-recognition of LGBT relationships and also criminalization, it makes it really difficult for queer couples of trans, of mixed nationalities or binational couples to actually have there was a lot of anxieties around their relationship and the future of their relationship. So we documented several cases like that. And I think refugees and migrant workers were definitely hard hit by the pandemic in Malaysia as well. Xenophobia was extremely high globally and in Malaysia too. And I think this is something that, a lot of LGBT groups as well had to sort of respond to the needs of refugees and migrant workers. I also want to just build on the point about the legal gender recognition and the identification card. So in Malaysia as well, in order to access humanitarian aid, one has to present the identification card as verification. And this makes it very difficult for trans people without legal gender recognition to present the legal documentation, because one, they're risking being outing themselves, and in a climate of increased transphobia, they're also afraid of discrimination and things like that. So the lack of legal gender recognition, I think, in Malaysia also has an impact on access to humanitarian aid, and that was clearly seen in some of our documentation. I think I'll end with similar to what folks have said. I think the COVID-19 period also saw a lot of mobilization by LGBT groups to address the needs of economically marginalized groups. And we've reached out to over 1,000 collectively LGBT households and people, and assisted their family members too. So I think this it was really great to see LGBT folks coming together to support not just LGBT people, but also sex workers and refugees and other groups too. I guess that I'll just end with that since we're over time. Okay.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think this conversation has been really important, but we always have such a limited time. But I think what really we wanted to do is we wanted to, sort of give a little bit of a teaser of what the report really presents, right? So Invisible, Isolated and Ignored, a report on human rights abuses, can be found on ICJ's website. We will also share it on our social medias so that you're able to read really the rich work that has been done in terms of speaking about the experiences of human rights violation in these 3 countries. But before we go, we wanted to know if you have, a paragraph also of just closing remarks of, it could be something that's a little bit more positive. I really like the talking about mobilization and talking about like what queerness seems to do is we sort of seem to always move and try and seek for freedom and seek for our rights, even in the most dire of circumstances. So what are some of the closing remarks? We can start with Santiago from Colombia, and then we can move on to Malaysia, and then we'll end with South Africa.
Well, thanks for the question. And only quickly 2 recommendations. The first is try to build bridges for the social society, for the government, for the NGOs, and try to think together about that kind of problems. And probably together we have the option or the possibility to find the solutions or partial solutions. And the second one is I don't know how like society we can solve those problems right now, but I think all the answer or the solution is mandatory be created with intersectional approach. This is very important because we need to create a very whole solutions and transform the life of the persons. So yeah, this is my 2 things I need to add to the conversation.
I guess I'll go. So thanks so much for having me. It was wonderful hearing from everybody. I guess moving forward, I guess this sort of learning spaces and cross-country region sort of conversations are so important, and especially in this sort of time where we are all, as what folks have said, we need to go back to the drawing blocks to sort of like redraw and reimagine things, right? So really appreciate this sort of conversation and hope we get to build collaboration at different scales and different levels. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
For me, firstly, thanks for having me. Thanks for everyone who's been watching. Thanks for the panel for sharing yourselves with us. I think that's very important. I think a lot of positives have come out of COVID, right? And they're hard to see at this moment, but the amount of cross-pollination in organizing that has happened has probably never happened at such a huge scale, right? We've had to ask people from different countries, have these conversations very openly. I think we've all had more Zoom conversations than we ever wanted, but we've learned a lot on Zoom, right? We've also learned that we actually don't need offices. So that's great. Yeah, I think a lot for organizing, a lot has come out of it. And I think these are lessons that we will take into the future. And because we cannot say there will never be another pandemic like this one, but no pandemic I don't think will ever hit organizing.
So I think that for me, what has kind of come out of this has been that there's so much that people can do. There's so much opportunity for doing so much. there's really an opportunity for government officials to lead and to provide leadership and to stand up, and for all those government officials out there who are members of the queer community themselves to come out and be visible, because we need you as our leaders. I think there's so much opportunity for activists to do this kind of networking and to look at how we can be more creative in our strategies, how we can change perceptions of our communities and get a kind of broad-based public support for the kind of law reform and changes, how we can work better and work together and less in silos and more intersectionally. And I think that there's the heroes that I really want to salute today is every member of the transgender community who is open and visible. Not everyone can be. The people who are in situations of danger have to keep themselves safe, and often that means wearing those masks that we've been talking about. But for those who are open, every one of you who stands up and who says, I'm trans, I'm non-binary, I'm queer, you're making a difference in society, and I would just like to salute all of you today.
I mean, thank you so much. I think that it's really important to think about, like, often people sort of glorify coming out, but not realizing that coming out in many instances is a luxury. And so in many ways reinforces this idea that, like, this world that we exist in is not for us, so we need to push ourselves in. So you are, like, it is correct for every one of us who remains visible. Thank you. We know it's not easy, but thank you for that. And thank you to each one of you for being so generous with your time and so generous with your words. We really appreciate just the knowledge. I think I'm going to sit back and watch this again because there's just a lot of nuggets that we can take from it.
Thank you so much once again to our amazing panel, and thank you to the ICJ as well for this opportunity. We look forward to interacting more with the report, and we look forward to the people who are watching at home also interacting with the report. And we're quite happy to see what engagements will come out of this. So thank you so much from the Cheekinators and from our wonderful panel. And we hope that you guys have a wonderful day later today.
Okay, and now we're going to be off. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good day.